The gun was already out of its holster before Susanna Dugan even realized her hand had moved. She stood in the center of the Waystation's main room, the oil lamp throwing wild shadows across the rough-hewn walls, her dark hair loose and tangled from sleep, her nightgown still tucked into the waistband of the trousers she had yanked on in a panic. Across from her, backed into the corner near the window, stood Nelson Winslow, and the look on his face was not the look of a man caught stealing or lying or sneaking away in the night. It was the look of a man who had been holding a terrible secret so long that the weight of it had finally cracked something behind his eyes. "You have exactly 10 seconds, Susanna said, and her voice did not shake, because Susanna Dugan's voice never shook, not even when she was terrified, to explain why you have my brother's watch in your coat pocket." The room was silent except for the distant lowing of cattle and the wind pressing at the shutters. Nelson Winslow, who had not spoken more than 40 words in the 3 days he had been stopping at the Waystation, who had eaten her food and watered his horse and looked at her with those gray eyes like he was memorizing something he expected to lose, that quiet, still, infuriating man opened his mouth. And then he closed it again. "Nelson." His name in her mouth was a warning and a plea all at once. "I knew your brother," he finally said. The words came out low and rough, like they had been pressed down into him for too long and were only now fighting their way out. "I was with him when he died." The gun wavered, just barely, just enough for Nelson to see it. "You were at the Haskell crossing," she said, and it was not a question. "I was." "Then you know what happened to him." "Yes." "And you have been here," Susanna said. And now the shake did come, but it was fury, not fear, pure hot fury that moved through her like a brand. "Sitting at my table and sleeping under my roof, and you never said a word." "No," Nelson said quietly. "I didn't." "Why?" He looked at her across that lamplit room, and there was something in his face that had no name she could put to it. Something that looked like the long aftermath of grief and guilt wound so tightly around a man that you could not find the seam between the two. "Because I owe you something," he said, "and I didn't know how to give it to you without telling you everything first, and I was afraid of what you'd do when I did." The gun dropped to her side but did not go back in the holster. "Start talking," Susanna Dugan said, "from the beginning." And so Nelson Winslow, the quietest man at the cattle drive, sat down at her table and told her the truth, all of it. Starting from the moment 6 months earlier when a foreman named Cal Deakins had hired 40 cowboys and a trail boss named Harlan Cross to drive 1,800 head of longhorn cattle across 300 miles of Wyoming Territory toward the rail depot at Cheyenne. Nelson had not wanted to go on that drive. He had been a quiet man by nature and by necessity, which were two different things, and the idea of spending 3 months in close company with 39 other men and more cattle than God probably intended to put in one place had struck him as a particular kind of punishment. But he owed Cal Deakins a debt, not money, but the other kind, the kind that settles in your chest and doesn't lift until you've paid it. And so, on a Thursday morning in late April of 1876, Nelson Winslow had saddled his roan gelding, checked the action on his Winchester, and ridden out to join the herd at the Deakins Ranch south of Laramie. The herd was enormous and noisy, and smelled the way that many cattle will smell, and the men who drove it were loud in the particular way that men become loud when they are nervous and trying not to show it. There were arguments about poker debts and arguments about the best way to ford a river and arguments about the cook's biscuits, which were, in fairness to the men complaining, not good biscuits. Nelson stayed out of all of it. He rode swing on the right side of the herd most days, keeping the cattle from drifting east, and when the day's riding was done, he sat near enough to the fire to get the warmth of it but far enough away that he was not expected to talk. The other men left him alone. This was not unfriendliness. It was the Western version of respect. If a man wants quiet, you give him quiet because you do not know what kind of history he is carrying and it is not your business to find out. There was one man, though, who did not leave him alone. His name was Daniel Dugan, and he was 24 years old and had the kind of personality that a room couldn't contain. He was the loudest man on the drive in a field of very loud men, and he laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them, and he called everyone partner regardless of whether they'd been introduced, and he had a habit of appearing at Nelson's side at the exact moment when Nelson had settled into a comfortable silence. "You know what your problem is," Daniel Dugan had said to him on the third day of the drive, riding up alongside Nelson's roan like they were already old friends. Nelson had looked at him sideways. "No, you think too loud," Daniel said. "A man gets a certain kind of expression when his thoughts are making noise, and yours look about as noisy as a train station." Nelson said nothing. "That's all right," Daniel said cheerfully. "I'll talk enough for both of us." And he had. God help them both, he had. For 6 weeks, Daniel Dugan rode alongside Nelson Winslow and talked about everything. About his family in Ohio. About the girl he had left behind in Cincinnati, who he thought might actually be the love of his life, but who had very reasonably told him he needed to stop wandering before she'd consider marrying him. About the war with himself he was conducting over whether to stay in Wyoming or go back east. He talked about his sister Susanna, who ran a Waystation on the northern route between Laramie and Cheyenne, who was, according to Daniel, the most formidable woman in 3 territories. "She's not loud because she's reckless," Daniel had told Nelson one evening, the firelight catching the earnest lines of his face. "She's loud because she decided a long time ago that if she was quiet, people would walk right over her, and she wasn't wrong. You can't run a Waystation alone as a woman in Wyoming Territory and be quiet about it. The world doesn't let you." Nelson had listened. He always listened, even when he didn't speak, which was part of why Daniel had chosen him for these conversations. Daniel was smart enough to know the difference between a man who wasn't listening and a man who was listening without needing to fill every pause. "She sounds like a handful," Nelson had said finally, which was the most he'd offered on the subject. Daniel had grinned. "She is, but the good kind, the kind that actually gets things done." 6 weeks in, they had come to the Haskell Crossing. The Haskell was a river crossing that was manageable in dry years and treacherous in wet ones, and 1876 had been a wet year in Wyoming. The river was high and fast and brown with runoff from the mountains, and trail boss Harlan Cross had stood on the bank for an hour looking at it before deciding they would cross in the morning when the current might have dropped and they would have full daylight. What Harlan Cross did not know, what none of them knew, was that a man named Silas Rourke had been following the drive for 2 weeks, waiting for exactly this kind of moment. Rourke was not a rustler in the traditional sense. He was something more organized and more dangerous. A man who worked for men with money who wanted other men's cattle for less money than buying them outright. He had 4 men with him, and a plan that was simple and brutal. They would cause a stampede at the crossing. In the chaos of 1,800 cattle in a swollen river, there would be confusion, and in that confusion, Rourke and his men would cut out 200 head from the far bank while the cowboys were occupied with drowning animals and drowning men. And by the time anyone sorted out the head count, Rourke would be 40 miles east with cattle that could be sold in Nebraska without any questions asked. What went wrong? What Rourke had not accounted for was Daniel Dugan. Daniel had been riding drag that day, eating dust at the back of the herd, and he had seen Rourke's men moving along the ridge line. He had seen the pattern of it, understood it in the way that a young man with sharp eyes sometimes understands things before older, more cautious men do. He had ridden hard for the front of the herd to warn Harlan Cross, and in doing so he had crossed into the path of the stampede that Rourke's men triggered with rifle fire at the worst possible moment. 3 horses went into the river that were never found. 2 men were badly hurt. 1 man was killed. Daniel Dugan was the one who was killed. Nelson had been the one who pulled him from the river, too late to matter. He had been the one who sat with Daniel while Daniel understood what was happening to him, and Daniel's last words, with the river still roaring past and the cattle gone mad on both banks, had been practical and heartbreaking in the way that young men's last words sometimes are. "Tell Susanna," Daniel had said. "Tell her I was going to go home. Tell her I had figured it out." Nelson had promised. And then he had carried that promise through 6 more weeks of cattle drive, and the final push into Cheyenne, and the long, quiet ride north toward the Waystation on the Laramie route. And somewhere in those long miles, the promise had turned into something he was afraid to deliver, because delivering it meant seeing what grief did to a woman who was already holding a whole world on her shoulders alone. He had arrived at the Waystation on a Tuesday. Susanna Dugan was in the yard when he rode up, arguing at full volume with a freighter named Bowden about the price of grain storage. She was 26 years old, dark-haired, brown-eyed, with the kind of competent beauty that comes from being entirely in command of yourself and your surroundings. She had her hands on her hips, and she was not backing down from Bowden, who was twice her size, and seemed to be discovering that this was not working in his favor. "I charge 4 cents a pound for grain storage," Susanna was saying, "because that is what grain storage costs in this territory, Mr. Bowden, and the fact that you have feelings about it does not change the arithmetic." Nelson had stopped his horse outside the gate and watched this, and something in him, the part that had been carrying Daniel Dugan's last words like a stone in his chest for 3 months, had shifted, just slightly, just enough to notice. Bowden had paid the 4 cents per pound. Susanna had turned to find a stranger at her gate and looked at him with the frank, assessing gaze of a woman who dealt with strangers every day and had learned to read them fast. "You need a room or a meal?" she called. "Both if you have them," Nelson said. "I have both. $1.50 for the night, meals included. Horse goes in the far corral. There's a boy named Petey who'll see to the water and hay." She paused. "You look like you've been riding a while." 3 months, he said. She had looked at him for a long moment, and even from across the yard he had felt the weight of her attention. It was not a hostile attention. It was the attention of someone who paid close notice to the world around them because the world around them was constantly trying to get away with something. "Come in then," she said. "Supper's at 6. He had come in. And for 3 days he had eaten her food and slept in her clean room and sat at the end of her long table, while she ran her Waystation at full volume, arguing with freighters, directing her hired hand Petey, haggling with the man who supplied her kerosene, reading aloud from the newspaper to anyone who would listen and several people who would not, laughing at things she found funny without waiting to see if anyone else found them funny too. And he had watched all of this with his quiet gray eyes, and he had not said the thing he had come here to say, because he could not find the right moment, and because, if he was being honest with himself, he had not wanted to end it. This strange, warm, loud, living thing that was Susanna Dugan's Waystation felt like the first real warmth he had been in since the Haskell crossing, and the moment he said Daniel's name, that warmth was going to turn into something else entirely. On the 3rd night, he had been unable to sleep. He had risen and come to the main room for water, and he had found Daniel's watch, which he had carried all these miles to return, fallen from his coat pocket where it hung on the peg by the door. He had picked it up and stood there holding it, and that was when Susanna's door had opened, and she had come out with a gun and sharp eyes that missed exactly nothing. Now at 2 in the morning, with the lamp burning between them and her gun still at her side, Susanna Dugan listened to all of it, every word. She did not interrupt, which was remarkable for a woman who, in Nelson's 3 days of observation, had opinions about almost everything and was not shy about voicing them. She sat very still and she listened to the whole story. The drive, Daniel, the crossing, Rourke, the river, the last words. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "He was going home," she finally said. "He was," Nelson said. "He had made up his mind. He told me about a woman in Cincinnati. He said he had figured out what he wanted." Susanna pressed her lips together, and the grief moved across her face like weather, fast and then gone, but real in the second it passed through. She was not a woman who let herself collapse, Nelson understood. She was a woman who had learned that collapsing was a luxury she couldn't afford. He sent letters, she said, mostly about cattle and card games. He mentioned you, actually. Nelson looked up. He said there was a man named Winslow who hadn't said 10 words in as many days, and he had decided it was his personal mission to make him talk. She met Nelson's eyes, and there was something complicated in her gaze. Something that was grief, and also, around the edges of it, something warmer. He said you were the best listener he'd ever found. He was the best talker, Nelson said, in the best way. Susanna set the gun on the table. Not put it away, I trust you. Just set it down, like she was making a conscious choice about what she was holding. Why did it take you 3 days? Nelson looked at the watch on the table between them. Because the moment I said it, this was going to change. Susanna looked at him for a long time. What was going to change? He didn't answer that. But she understood, because she had 26 years of reading people built into her, and she could see the answer in the careful way he held himself, in the fact that a man who owed a promise to her dead brother had ridden 3 months to deliver it and then sat at her table for 3 days losing his nerve. Nelson Winslow, she said slowly, testing the name. Yes, you are the strangest man I have ever had under my roof. Probably, he agreed. And the quietest. Yes. She picked up the watch and turned it over in her fingers. Their father had given it to Daniel on his 16th birthday. She had been 14, and she had pretended she didn't care about the favoritism, and Daniel had known she was pretending and had let her hold it whenever she wanted. Thank you, she said finally, for bringing this back. I promised him. I know. She stood up, and for a moment she just looked at him, this quiet, steady, gray-eyed man who had been carrying her brother's last words through 3 months of hard country. Go back to sleep, Nelson. We'll talk more in the morning. He nodded and stood. Nelson, he stopped. You're not leaving tomorrow, Susanna said, and it was not quite a question and not quite a command, but it landed somewhere between the two with the precision of someone who meant exactly what they said. He thought about the road ahead, which had no particular destination attached to it. He thought about the warmth of this room and the way she ran her world at full volume without apology. No, he said, I'm not. He went back to his room. Susanna sat at the table alone for a long time, holding the watch and letting herself feel the grief in the full privacy of the small hours. She let it move through her, and she breathed through it, and she thought about Daniel laughing too loud at his own jokes. And then, when it had passed enough for her to put it away in the deep place where she stored things she couldn't afford to carry on the surface, she thought about the man who had just told her the truth, and found that she was not ready for him to leave. Morning at the Waystation started early and started loud, which Nelson learned on his first day and had by now accepted as a fixed feature of the universe. By 5:30, the yard was alive with the sounds of Susanna directing Petey, a boy of 16 who was not dim but who operated at a speed Susanna found perpetually insufficient, about which horses needed watering, which freight needed to be moved to make room for a supply wagon due in the afternoon, and what exactly had happened to the spare bucket she had left by the pump not 3 days ago. Nelson came out of his room, hat in hand, to find her at the stove cooking eggs with the focused energy of a woman who did everything at full commitment, including breakfast. You can pour the coffee, she said without turning around. Cups are on the shelf. He poured 2 cups and set one at her elbow without being asked, which she noticed. There's a man coming today, she said, sliding eggs onto 2 plates and setting them on the table. A lawyer named Hartwick from Cheyenne. He's been handling Daniel's affairs. She said it straight without flinching, which told him she'd had the early hours to do her flinching in private. He's been in contact by letter, but this will be the first time he's come in person. I don't know if there's anything to Daniel's estate beyond the wages he was owed. Cal Deakins owes those wages, Nelson said, sitting down across from her. He's a fair man. He'll have sent them. He has. I received the payment last month. She picked up her fork. What I need to know from this lawyer is whether Daniel had any debt. He had a habit of borrowing ahead of what he had. He mentioned that, Nelson said. Susanna looked up. He talked about his debts to you. He talked about everything, Nelson said, including the fact that you always covered them when he couldn't. Something moved across her face, exasperation and love intertwined, the specific expression of a sibling who has spent years cleaning up after someone and would not trade a single instance of it. "He talked too much," she said, but gently. "Yes," Nelson agreed. "It was his best quality." She laughed, and it was the first time since the night before that the air in the room felt fully alive. Her laugh was like her voice, no apology in it, no restraint, just sound, just feeling, landing in the room and filling it. Nelson found himself looking at his egg so she wouldn't see the way it hit him. Hartwick arrived at midday in a good coat and bad boots, the mark of a man who was comfortable in offices and less comfortable in territory. He was polite and efficient and delivered his news without drama. Daniel had one debt, a sum of $30 owed to a man in Laramie named Stokes. Against that, he had a small amount saved, $42, deposited with the land office. Net result, $12 in Susanna's favor, which after Hartwick's modest fee came to $7 for a brother's life, which Susanna accepted with a face that said she understood perfectly that money had nothing to do with it. Hartwick also produced a letter. He handed it to Susanna with a careful, practiced gentleness that told Nelson this part of his work still affected him despite years of practice. "It was lodged with his things at the Cheyenne land office," Hartwick said. "Intended for you in the event of his death." He had written it approximately a year ago before the drive. Susanna held the letter without opening it for a long moment. Then she looked at Nelson. "Stay," she said. He stayed. She opened the letter and read it at the table, and Nelson looked at his coffee and gave her what privacy he could while being in the same room, which he understood was what she wanted, not to be alone, but to have someone there who already knew the whole story. When she finished, she set it down, and her eyes were bright, but she did not cry. "He said I was the best person he knew," she said. "He said he was sorry for every time he made more trouble than he was worth." She paused. "And he said I needed to stop running this Waystation like it was a fortress and let someone in." Nelson said nothing. "He had opinions about my personal life," Susanna said, with the precise tone of someone who is both fond and irritated by this fact. "He had opinions about everything," Nelson said. "Yes." She folded the letter and held it in her hands. "He was usually right." The afternoon brought the supply wagon, and then a group of 4 miners heading south who needed dinner and beds for the night, and then a woman traveling alone with 2 children who was trying to reach her sister in Laramie and had run out of both money and food. Susanna fed the woman and the children without charging them, found them a room for the night, and spent 15 minutes drafting a letter on their behalf to the Laramie Women's Aid Society, all while simultaneously managing the miners' demands for whiskey, which she did not serve, a fact that led to a brief and vigorous negotiation that ended with the miners accepting coffee and bread and settling down to a more sober evening than they had planned. Nelson watched all of this from various positions around the Waystation, and somewhere around the time she was writing the letter for the traveling woman, picked up a hammer and repaired the broken hinge on the door to the back corral that had been dragging for what appeared to have been a significant period of time, given the rut in the ground beneath it. PD noticed this and reported it to Susanna, who came to look at it during a brief quiet moment in the late afternoon. "I was going to fix that," she said, looking at the hinge with her arms crossed. "I noticed," Nelson said. "I've been going to fix it for a month. I had the time." She looked at him. "You don't have to earn your keep. You've already paid your board." "I know," he said. He went back to the task of straightening the latch pin. Susanna watched him work for a moment. "There's a section of fence on the south side that needs 2 new posts," she said, as if thinking aloud. "I can do that tomorrow," Nelson said. "I haven't asked you to." "No," he said, "but I will anyway." She stood for a moment longer, and the feeling that moved through her was complicated and new, and she did not entirely have a name for it. But it was something in the neighborhood of being understood without having to explain yourself, which was not a feeling Susanna Dugan had a great deal of experience with. She went back to her guests. But she was smiling, just slightly. in a way that only the late afternoon light in the back of the corral could see. The fence posts took Nelson most of the next morning, which was fine because he was a methodical worker, and the soil in that section was rocky and made the digging slow. By midday he had both posts in and was tamping the second one solid when Susanna brought him water without making a production of it, just set the cup on the fence rail and stood for a moment with her face turned up to the sun. "Hartwick told me before he left," she said, "that the man who caused the stampede was arrested in Nebraska 2 weeks ago. A marshal there picked him up for a similar scheme with a different outfit." Nelson set down his tamping bar. "Good. He'll hang, probably." She said it without satisfaction, which surprised him. "It won't bring Daniel back, but at least no one else is going to lose a brother to him." "No," Nelson agreed. "I want to write to the marshal," Susanna said. "I want them to know Daniel's name, that he was one of the people Rourke killed, even if it looks like an accident on paper." "I can help you write it," Nelson said. "I was there. I can say what I saw." She turned to look at him, and in the full midday light she was striking in the way of people who are not conventionally beautiful but are so completely themselves that you can't look away. "You do that?" "Yes. Even though it means putting your name on a court document." "Yes." She looked at him for another moment. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. When I thought about the man who was with Daniel at the end, I thought I'd feel." She searched for the word. "Complicated about him, like there would be things I needed to work out. And you don't." She considered this honestly, the way she did everything. "I feel complicated about Rourke. I feel complicated about the river and the crossing and the decisions that were made, but not about you." She picked up the empty water cup from the rail. "You did everything you could, and then you kept a promise. That's all a person can do." She went back to the Waystation. Nelson stood for a moment with his hand on the new fence post, solid and straight in the rocky ground, and felt something in his chest that he didn't have a name for, but that was, for the first time in 3 months, not entirely weighted with grief. The letter to the marshal took them 2 evenings, sitting across from each other at the table after the Waystation guests had gone to bed, with Susanna's neat hand writing what they decided together, which turned out to be a surprisingly collaborative process. Susanna was precise with language, and Nelson had the factual clarity of a man who had trained himself to pay close attention. And between them, the letter was both accurate and human in a way that a purely legal document wouldn't have been. On the first evening, they worked mostly in the formal space of the task. On the second evening, after the letter was finished and sealed for sending with the next southbound rider, they stayed at the table because neither of them moved to go to bed, and the conversation drifted sideways into other territory. "Where are you from?" Susanna asked. "Originally, Tennessee, before the war." She looked at him. "You fought?" "Yes." She waited to see if he would say more, and when he didn't, she did not press. She had been raised in Ohio, which had sent more than its share of men to that war, and she knew enough to recognize that some men had put that time away behind a door that didn't open from the outside. "After the war," she said, steering gently, "you came west." "Eventually, I did some work in Kansas for a time, some trail work, a season on a ranch in Colorado." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I'm not a settler, I know that about myself." "Neither was Daniel," she said. "I always hoped he would be eventually, but it wasn't in him the way it wasn't in our father." She paused. "Our father left for California when I was 12. We never heard from him again. Our mother worked herself to illness over the next 4 years, and then she died too. And I was 16, and I had Daniel, who was 14, and I had $50 in a tin box, and I had to decide what to do." Nelson was very still, listening, because she was giving him something. A man named Gorman was selling this Waystation. He'd been trying to make it work for 3 years and couldn't. He wanted $200, which I didn't have, so I told him I would pay him $40 now and the rest over 5 years out of the revenue. She smiled at her own nerve. I was 16. I had no reason to be confident that would work. But it did. It did, because I was not going to let it not work. She looked around the room with the particular expression of someone who has built something out of almost nothing and knows it and is quietly, privately proud. I paid off the last of Gorman's money when I was 22. This place is mine, free and clear. Daniel told me, Nelson said. He was proud of you. He was a better brother than he was a grown man, she said, with the specific tenderness of grief that has turned into something you can hold without being cut by it. He kept coming back here between jobs. He would help out for a few weeks and then get restless and ride off again. I was used to it. He was trying to figure out how to stay, Nelson said. That's what he was working on the last few months. I know. She touched the watch, which she now kept in her apron pocket. He almost made it. They sat in the quiet, and it was a different kind of quiet than Nelson was used to creating for himself. It was a shared quiet which had warmth in it. The lamp burned low between them, and the Wyoming night pressed at the shutters, cold and vast and indifferent. And inside the Waystation it was warm, and they were two people who had found their way to the same table by a set of circumstances that would have seemed improbable to either of them a year ago. Nelson, Susanna said. Yes. What were you planning to do after you left here? He looked at the table. I didn't have a plan. You must have had something in mind. South, maybe. There's always work with the drives going south, or north if the ranches in Montana are hiring. And you're content with that. He turned the question over honestly. I'm not sure what I am now. She did not reply to that immediately, which was unusual for Susanna. She sat with it for a moment in a way that suggested she was turning over something of her own. The Waystation needs work, she finally said. Real work, not just fence posts. The roof on the barn needs patching before winter. The east room has a floor that's going to go through if someone steps wrong. The well needs the casing reset. Petey says it's tilted, and he's right, and I haven't had anyone with the skills to fix it. She said all of this to the lamp, not to him. Petey is a good boy, but he's 16 and will go his own way in another year. I need help. Nelson looked at her. I'm not asking for charity, she said quickly, looking up with the direct gaze of someone who needed to be very clear about this. I'm asking if you want work, real wages, room and board included. Susanna. I know it's not driving cattle across Wyoming, and I know, Susanna, he said again, and she stopped. He had a gift, she was discovering, for stopping her by simply saying her name in a certain way, not loud, not commanding, just present, like he was placing a hand on her shoulder without touching her. Yes, she said more quietly. I'll stay, he said. The breath she let out was not quite a sigh, but it was the sound of someone who had been holding something carefully and had just been allowed to put it down. Good, she said, with all the brisk practicality of a woman who was not going to make a fuss about the fact that she was relieved. We'll settle the wages in the morning. Yes, he said. The wages are fair, she said, as if he had implied otherwise. I know, he said. I've been here 5 days, and I know you don't do anything that isn't fair. She looked at him sharply, but there was nothing in his expression except sincerity. You're an odd man, Nelson Winslow. Yes, he agreed. Good night, Susanna. Good night, she said. He was very careful, in the weeks that followed, not to make her feel watched or crowded. This was partly his nature and partly a conscious choice, because he understood that Susanna Dugan had been running her world alone for a long time, and that any man who tried to insert himself as if he were in charge of it would find the experience unpleasant and brief. He worked the jobs she gave him and did them well and did not wait to be thanked, because she showed appreciation through efficiency. When she trusted you to do something without supervising you, that was her highest compliment. The barn roof took 4 days and was genuinely miserable work, requiring a significant amount of time in high places in autumn wind. But when it was done, it was solid and would see the place through another 5 Wyoming winters. The east room floor was easier once he found the rotted joists and replaced them. The well casing was the hardest job, requiring Petey's help and a borrowed come-along from a freighter named Mac who came through every Thursday and was willing to lend his equipment to a good cause. While Nelson worked, the Waystation moved around him in its perpetual loud life. Riders came and went. Freighters stopped and argued about rates and ultimately paid them. Travelers came through with stories from the wider world, news from the East about the presidential election, which Susanna had very definite opinions about. News from the North about the Army campaigns against the Lakota and Cheyenne in the aftermath of the Little Bighorn, which she had opinions about as well, and which led to a conversation with Nelson one evening that went long into the night because he had been in Colorado during some of those years and had his own knowledge of what the territory had looked like before and what it looked like now. "My father used to say that the West was the place a man could be anything he wanted," she said, with a bitterness that was specific and earned, not casual. "What he never said was that it only worked that way if you were the right kind of man." "He wasn't wrong about that," Nelson said. "Daniel used to argue with me about it. He said it was getting better." Was he right? Susanna thought about it seriously, which was how she thought about everything. In some ways, not enough ways, not fast enough. She looked at the fire. That woman who came through last month, the one with the 2 children trying to reach her sister. She left Ohio because her husband beat her. She had nowhere to go. She had 7 cents to her name. What happened to her? The Women's Aid Society in Laramie found her a room and a position at a hotel. She writes to me. Susanna's expression settled into something that was satisfaction and grief twisted together. She's all right now, but she shouldn't have had to be in that position in the first place. No, Nelson said, she shouldn't have. These were the conversations that built something between them, not the dramatic ones, not the moments of high feeling, but these quiet late-night exchanges about the world and what they each understood of it. Nelson listened and thought and occasionally said things that surprised her, because he had seen a great deal in his quiet years of moving through the West and had formed views about it that he rarely offered but that, once offered, were worth hearing. And she talked. God, she talked. About everything, the price of grain and the politics in Washington, and the book she was reading and the terrible quality of the coffee at the Waystation in the next county, and the argument she'd had with Petey about the horses and the correct technique for splitting firewood, which she felt very strongly about. She talked the way Daniel had talked, with the same abundance and the same underlying intelligence running through it, and Nelson understood for the first time why Daniel had sought him out on the cattle drive, because it was the same impulse. This person needs someone who will actually listen, and I am going to be that person. Except that with Susanna, it ran both ways. He started to notice, after the 3rd week, that she had begun to listen to him differently than she listened to other people. Not with more attention. She was always attentive, but with a particular quality of stillness that she didn't offer to everyone. When he spoke, she stopped whatever she was doing. Not obviously, not in a way that either of them acknowledged, but he noticed. He noticed everything, quietly. He also noticed that she had begun to smile before he finished his sentences sometimes, in the way of someone who has learned to anticipate the shape of another person's thoughts, and that she had started leaving coffee on the stove in the mornings specifically because she knew he was an early riser and would want it before breakfast, and that she had moved her account books to the table in the evenings rather than doing them in her room, which was technically more efficient for her, but meant she was in the main room at the hours when he most often came to sit there. None of this was said between them. It was conducted entirely in the language of small practical adjustments, which was the language of people who were afraid that the other thing, the real thing, might not be possible, and so were approaching it from an angle so oblique that no one could call them on it. The crisis came 6 weeks after Nelson's arrival, on a Saturday in late October. A man rode into the Waystation yard in the early afternoon, who Nelson recognized from 100 yards away by the set of his shoulders, and whose recognition caused a feeling to move through him that was not exactly fear, but was the cousin of it, the particular alertness of a man who has learned to pay attention to danger. His name was Cole Enders, and he was the kind of man that certain ranchers and certain operations hired when they needed something done that they could not do themselves, and also could not be associated with. He and Nelson had crossed paths twice in the past, never in circumstances that were entirely comfortable. He was not a killer in the simple sense. He was more specialized than that. He was a man who found things out and then found leverage in what he had found, and he used that leverage professionally. Enders tied his horse at the rail and walked into the Waystation like he owned it, which was his habit everywhere, and found Susanna at the counter talking to a traveling salesman about the quality of his boot polish. "I need to see the man who's working here," Enders said, without waiting for the salesman to finish his sentence. Susanna turned to look at him. Nelson was in the yard but could see through the window, and he watched the exact moment that Susanna took the measure of Cole Enders and arrived at an accurate conclusion about his character. "You can wait outside," she said pleasantly, which in Susanna's vocabulary was not a pleasant thing to say. Enders looked at her with the flat patience of a man who was used to being in the room while other people worked out whether they wanted to cooperate with him. "I'll wait inside." "I said outside," Susanna said, without changing her tone. "This is my business and I'm in the middle of a conversation. You'll wait until I'm done, and you'll wait where I tell you, or you won't wait at all." There was a moment. Enders was not used to this response from a woman running a Waystation. He reassessed, decided it was not worth the effort, and went back outside. The salesman, who had stopped breathing during the exchange, resumed breathing. Nelson met Enders in the yard. "Winslow," Enders said. "Enders, you're a hard man to find when you don't want to be found." "I wasn't hiding," Nelson said. "I was working." "So I see." Enders looked at the Waystation with an expression that Nelson did not like. "Interesting work for a man like you. What do you want, Cole?" Enders reached into his coat slowly, making the movement visible, and produced an envelope. "I've been hired to find you." "By a man named Harlan Cross." Nelson went very still. "Cross is alive." "Very much so. He came out of the Haskell crossing better than some of his crew." Enders held out the envelope. "He has a question for you." Nelson took the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper in Cross's handwriting, which Nelson recognized as the handwriting of a man who had learned his letters late in life and wrote with great care and deliberation. The letter said, "Winslow, I know you saw Rourke's men before the crossing. I know you told no one. The marshal in Nebraska wants a statement. You can give it to me and I'll take it to him, or you can give it to the law yourself. But either way, I need to know what you know, because the trial starts in November and Rourke's lawyer is trying to say it was an accident. Daniel Dugan's name deserves better than that. Come to Laramie or send word." Nelson read this twice and then looked at Enders. "Cross hired you to find me. He said you were reliable but could be anywhere between here and Colorado. He was right on both counts." Enders glanced toward the Waystation. "That woman in there," he said more quietly. "She's the Dugan girl, the dead man's sister." "Yes," Nelson said. "Cross knows about her," Enders said. "He sent a letter there as well, probably arriving next week by post. He wanted to make sure someone told her about the trial." "She already knows," Nelson said. "We wrote to the marshal together." Enders looked at him for a moment with the assessing gaze of a man who collected information about people for a living. "Winslow, I've known you for 6 years. You are not a man who stops moving." "People change," Nelson said. Enders looked at the Waystation again, and this time his expression was not unpleasant. It was something closer to understanding. "Some of them do," he said. He took back the envelope. "I'll tell Cross you received the message. You should go to Laramie for the trial." "I will." Enders mounted his horse and rode out. Nelson stood in the yard and looked at the letter for a moment, and then he went inside and found Susanna finishing up with the salesman, who departed with his boot polish and his dignity somewhat restored. "What did he want?" she said. Nelson laid Cross's letter on the counter. "The trial for Rourke is in November. Harlan Cross wants me in Laramie to give a statement." Susanna read the letter. He watched the sequence of emotions cross her face: sharp grief, then determination, then a quieter resolution that settled like bedrock under everything else. "We'll both go," she said. "Susanna, he was my brother," she said. And then, because she was Susanna and she could say two things at once without trying, "And I'm not letting you ride to Laramie alone when there is a man on trial who might prefer that you not arrive." The thought that she was worried about him hit Nelson somewhere in the center of his chest and moved through him like heat. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. They made arrangements. Petey was old enough and capable enough to keep the Waystation running for a week, and a neighboring woman named Mrs. Holt, who came in twice a week to help with the washing, agreed to be on hand for any situation that exceeded Petey's experience. Susanna wrote to Harlan Cross to say they were coming, packed her traveling bag with the efficiency of someone who did not believe in overpacking, and presented herself at the yard at 5 in the morning 2 days later in a good coat and a traveling hat that she wore with the air of someone who was not particularly interested in fashion, but understood that arriving in Laramie looking like a capable, serious person was a strategic advantage. Nelson had the horses ready. He had also, without discussion, packed a second revolver on the grounds that Cole Enders was right. Rourke was a man with connections, and a man with connections and a trial coming had reason to want certain witnesses unavailable. They rode to Laramie in 2 days, stopping overnight at another Waystation south of town, where the keeper was a man named Prout who knew Susanna by reputation and treated her accordingly. Susanna was good company on the road, which Nelson had suspected but found was true in a way that was better than expected. She did not talk constantly. She had a traveler's instinct for when to talk and when to ride quietly and let the country be what it was, and the quiet between them on the road was comfortable in the way that quiet only becomes when two people have established enough trust that silence doesn't need to be filled. In the second afternoon, with Laramie visible in the distance, she said suddenly, "Nelson, what will you do after the trial?" He kept his eyes on the road ahead. "I hadn't thought that far." "You have been at the Waystation for 6 weeks," she said. "You've fixed the barn and the floor and the well and about 9 other things. You've worked hard and you've been paid fairly, I hope." "Very fairly. But that isn't enough to build a life on," she said. "I just mean I want to know if you're planning to stay or planning to leave, because I find I need to make plans of my own and I can't make them properly without knowing." Nelson turned to look at her, and she was looking ahead with her chin up and her cheeks slightly pink from the wind or possibly from something else, and the afternoon light was doing something unkind to his ability to think clearly. "What plans?" he said. She glanced at him sideways. "I've been thinking about expanding. There's a room on the north side that could become a proper dining room if it was built out. If I had more room, I could take in more travelers and charge more for the meals because they'd be eating in an actual room and not at a kitchen table. It would mean a loan, and a loan means a commitment to a certain income over a period of years, and that kind of plan requires knowing who's going to be there to carry the work." She was telling him something. She was telling him in the most practical, Susanna way she could find, but she was telling him. "Susanna," he said. "Yes," she said, still looking ahead. "Stop talking about the dining room for a moment." She stopped. "I'm not leaving," he said. "I haven't been planning to leave for at least 3 weeks. I just hadn't found the right moment to say so, which is a habit of mine." She turned to look at him fully now, and the pink in her cheeks was not the wind. "You could have said," she said. "I know. I've been wondering," she said, and for Susanna this was a significant admission because she was not a woman who acknowledged uncertainty readily, "for several weeks now." "I know," he said again. "You are maddening," she said, but without heat in it. "Yes," he agreed. "I'm sorry." She looked at him for a moment longer, and the afternoon light was golden and the road was empty, and Nelson Winslow thought that if he were ever going to say the rest of what he was thinking, it was probably now. "I don't want to leave," he said carefully, "because you are the most alive person I have met in a very long time, and I find that I have no interest in going back to a life without that in it." Susanna was quiet for a moment. "That," she said finally, "is the most words you have said at one time since you arrived." "Yes," he said. "Don't ruin it by saying something else." He didn't. They rode the rest of the way to Laramie in the kind of quiet that had changed its quality, entirely warm and certain. and full of something that neither of them had named yet, but that both of them could feel, settled like a new weight in their chests, the comfortable kind. Laramie was a proper town by Wyoming standards, a main street with a bank and a hotel and a land office and a saloon and the other essential furniture of frontier civilization. The trial of Silas Rourke was not the biggest event in the town's history, but it had drawn attention, and there was a restlessness in the air around the courthouse that Nelson was alert to. They found Harlan Cross at the hotel, older looking than Nelson remembered, his face showing the particular weathering of a man who has carried the weight of what happened at the Haskell crossing. Cross stood when Susanna came into the room and removed his hat, and the meeting between them had a formality and weight to it that Nelson stood back from, giving them space. Miss Dugan, Cross said, I am sorry for your brother. He was a good hand and a better man. He was, Susanna said, and I want to make sure the record says what happened. That's why we're here, Cross said. He looked at Nelson over Susanna's shoulder. Winslow, you look like you found something worth stopping for. Yes, Nelson said simply. Cross looked between them and seemed to make several accurate observations from this single word and the way they stood relative to each other, and said nothing further about it. The trial was 2 days. Nelson gave his statement clearly and without drama, describing what he had seen at the ridge line before Rourke's men fired, and the testimony was good enough that Rourke's lawyer, who had been working hard to establish accident as a theory, had to abandon it entirely. Susanna sat in the courtroom gallery and did not fidget and did not look away from the proceedings, and when Nelson's statement was done and he came back to sit beside her, she put her hand on top of his hand for a moment, just a moment, brief and deliberate, and then put it back in her lap. Rourke was convicted of murder and conspiracy. The sentencing would come the following week, and it was understood by everyone in the room what the sentence would be. After the verdict, standing outside the courthouse in the cold October air, Susanna turned her face up and breathed out, and something went out of her, not all the grief, but the part of it that had been unsettled, looking for a resolution that the world owed her. Good, she said. Good. Nelson stood beside her. There was no appropriate thing to say, so he said nothing, and she was glad. They had dinner at the hotel restaurant, a formal meal, better than anything either of them typically ate, which Susanna enjoyed with the open pleasure of a woman who did not pretend to be above good food. They talked about the trial and then about other things, and the conversation moved easily between them the way it had learned to do, and when the meal was over and the evening had gotten late and they were walking back through the hotel corridor to their separate rooms, Nelson stopped at his door and turned to face her. Susanna, he said. She stopped. She was looking at him with those dark eyes that missed nothing. I'd like to court you, he said, properly, if you're willing. The corner of her mouth moved, just slightly. Court me, she repeated. Yes. Nelson Winslow, she said. We have been living in the same building and eating every meal together, and you have heard me in a nightgown at 2 in the morning with a gun. I think we may have bypassed some of the traditional steps. Probably, he said. I'd still like to do it right. She looked at him for a long moment, and the hotel corridor was quiet around them, and the lamplight was the same quality as the lamplight in her Waystation, and he was watching her with those steady gray eyes that had been watching her since the first day with an attention she had learned to trust completely. Yes, she said. I'm willing. He nodded once, with the contained quality of someone whose feelings were very large and very carefully held. Good night, Susanna. Good night, Nelson, she said, and the way she said his name had changed in some way that she could feel but couldn't quite describe, like a key turning in a lock that you didn't know was locked. The ride back to the Waystation was different from the ride down, lighter in some essential way, as if they had both put down something heavy and found that without it they moved differently. They stopped at the same Waystation overnight, and Prout commented to his wife afterward that Miss Dugan looked like a woman who had resolved something significant, and his wife said that the quiet man with her looked at Miss Dugan the way a person looks at a fixed star when they have been navigating by it for long enough that they know exactly where it sits in the sky. The next months were the most surprising of Nelson Winslow's adult life. He was, by nature and by long practice, a man who expected things to end. Jobs ended. Seasons ended. The momentum of the drive always pointed toward the destination, and once you reached it, you scattered. He had carried this expectation like a compass set permanently to departure, and arriving somewhere, really arriving, not just stopping, was a skill he had not known he needed to relearn. But the Waystation did not end. Every morning it began again, with Susanna's voice in the yard and the smell of coffee and the sound of Petey's boots on the steps. And there were new guests every week and new problems to solve and new conversations at the table in the evenings. And none of it ended. It just continued. And Nelson discovered that continuing was a thing he was capable of. He courted her properly, which in the context of a Waystation meant bringing her coffee at exactly the right temperature without being asked, and sitting beside her on the step in the evenings when the day was over, and listening to her read the newspaper aloud. She had opinions about everything in it, and occasionally saying things that made her laugh, which was one of his private satisfactions because her laugh was still the best sound in any room it occupied. He also, in the privacy of his room on the evenings when he couldn't sleep, wrote 2 letters. One was to his sister in Tennessee, whom he had not written to in 3 years and who had, by all evidence, written him off as lost to the West. The other was to a man in Denver who owed him a modest sum of money, which he had never pressed for because he had not needed it, but which he now thought he might need. He did not explain these letters to Susanna, but she noticed the writing at night, through his open door on evenings when the lamp was burning late, and she noticed that he was more settled in some way she couldn't quite put her finger on, as if he had made a decision and was working through the practical steps of it. In December, 2 months after Laramie, he asked to speak to her privately one evening after the last guests had retired. He was nervous, which was a state she had never seen him in. He was hiding it well, but she could see the effort, and the fact that he was nervous made her own heart beat faster, because Nelson Winslow's composure was one of the fixed facts of her world, and if something was moving underneath it, it was significant. He sat across from her at the table where they had first talked, in the lamplight that had been the setting for everything important between them, and he put a ring on the table. It was not a grand ring. It was a simple gold band, small and plain, the kind a man buys when he is not a rich man but is buying something he wants to last. He had bought it from a jeweler in Laramie on the day of the trial, which meant he had been carrying it for 2 months, which meant the decision had been made much longer ago than tonight. "Susanna," he said. "Nelson," she said, in the same tone, meeting him fully. "I know I'm not a man with land or a great deal of money. I have wages and skills and the intention to stay put, which I understand is a lower bar than some would set." He looked at the ring on the table between them. "I love you. I have been in love with you since approximately the 2nd day, which I recognize is fast for a man who takes as long as I do to say anything at all." Susanna pressed her lips together very hard. "I would like to marry you," he said, "and work beside you here for as long as you'll have me, and not leave. I want—" He paused, and for a moment the feeling behind the words was visible in his face without the words covering it. "I want to stay, Susanna. I want this to be the place I stay." Susanna picked up the ring. "You bought this in Laramie," she said. "Yes." "On the day of the trial." "Yes." "Nelson, that was 2 months ago." "Yes," he said, with the careful expression of a man who knows he is about to be told exactly how long he has been not saying something. "You are maddening," she said, and her voice was breaking slightly at the edges, which was the closest she came to tears in front of other people, even people she loved. "You are the most infuriating, quiet, deliberate, maddening—" "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'll marry you. Yes." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she held on to it, and the lamp burned between them in the Waystation that she had built from $50 and a 16-year-old girl's refusal to give up, and everything was very still and very warm and very certain. They were married in February on a Wednesday, because Saturday was too busy with freighters and Wednesday was manageable. The ceremony was performed by a circuit preacher named Calloway who came through the Waystation every 6 weeks and who was delighted to perform the service. The guests were Petey, who cleaned his boots for the occasion, Mrs. Holt, who brought a cake she had been planning for 3 weeks, and Harlan Cross, who rode up from Laramie specifically because he felt he owed it to Daniel Dugan to be there when his sister got something good. Susanna wore her best dress, which was green and well-made and suited her, and she looked at Nelson across the small ceremony with eyes that were so direct and so full of everything she felt that Harlan Cross, standing to the side, had to look at the floor for a moment. Nelson said his vows quietly, in the way he did everything, and clearly because he had decided exactly what he meant to say and did not hesitate once he started saying it. Susanna said hers with the full force of her personality, which meant that Preacher Calloway was slightly overwhelmed by the sincerity of it and forgot his next line. After the cake and the congratulations and Cross's speech, which was short and good, and Petey's speech, which was short and endearingly bad, the guests departed and Nelson and Susanna were alone in the Waystation for the first time as its joint inhabitants rather than its separate ones. She stood in the middle of the main room in her green dress and looked at him with the frank and open gaze of a woman who did not hide what she felt. "Well," she said, "here we are." "Here we are," Nelson agreed. "I should tell you," she said, "that I intend to keep running this place exactly as I have been." "I know," he said, "I wouldn't have it any other way. And I intend to keep arguing with freighters about rates. I'd be concerned if you stopped. And I will probably always be the loudest person in any room." "Yes," he said, and the way he said it, warm and certain, not resigned, not tolerant, but genuinely, completely glad of it, made her breath catch. "Good," she said. "I'm glad we understand each other." He crossed the room and took her face in his hands and kissed her, and she kissed him back with the full, uncomplicated force of a woman who had decided something and did not go back on her decisions. Spring came to Wyoming with the specific intensity of spring in cold country, where the warmth arrives so fast and so bright after months of gray that it feels almost violent in its beauty. The snowmelt ran in the gulches and the grass came up green and fierce, and the road past the Waystation filled with the traffic of a new season, ranchers moving stock to summer range, freighters bringing the first supplies of the year, travelers who had waited out the winter somewhere and were now moving again. Nelson built the addition on the north side of the Waystation, the dining room that Susanna had been planning when she told him she needed to know if he was staying. He was a good carpenter, better than good, actually, because he had the patience for it and the precision, and Susanna had the vision and the opinions about every detail, which resulted in an ongoing conversation about windows and ceiling height, and the position of the stove that went on for the entire 3 weeks of construction, and was, by any measure, one of the most fun negotiations either of them had ever conducted. The dining room was finished in May and seated 12 people, with a proper iron stove in the corner, and windows on 2 sides that let in the afternoon light. Susanna opened it on a Thursday and charged 10 cents more per meal than she had before, and not a single traveler complained, because the room was warm and the food was good, and Susanna Dugan's Waystation had a reputation by now that preceded it across several hundred miles of Wyoming Territory. In June, Susanna told Nelson she was expecting. She told him in the morning, before anyone else was awake, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with her coffee, direct and without preamble, because she was Susanna, and there was no other way she knew how to deliver news. He sat very still for a moment, the way he did when something moved through him that was too large to immediately speak. Then he set down his cup, came around the table and held her. She let herself be held, which was its own statement, because Susanna Dugan did not typically allow herself to lean on anyone, and the fact that she leaned into Nelson now, just for a moment, just fully told him everything about how much this meant. "Are you pleased?" she said into his shoulder. "Yes," he said. He said it the way he said everything important once completely. "Good," she said. She straightened up and picked up her coffee. "Petey will need to take over more of the yard work in the later months. I'll need to be," she paused. "I'll need to be sensible about some things." "You will be," he said, with the confidence of someone who had watched her be sensible about everything for the better part of a year. "I am always sensible," she said. "You are always effective," he said, which was more precisely true and which she accepted as the compliment it was. Their son was born in January of 1878, in the bedroom of the Waystation, delivered by a midwife named Caldwell who came from the town 12 miles south, and who was unimpressed by any amount of complication, which was fortunate because Susanna was Susanna about the labor process, which is to say she had opinions about it and communicated them clearly throughout. Nelson sat outside the door and did not pace, because he was not a pacer, but he sat with his hands laced together and his head bowed, and the particular stillness of a man who is praying in his own wordless way. When the midwife opened the door and told him everything was fine and he could come in, he went in very quietly and found Susanna propped against the pillows looking exhausted and fierce and completely herself, holding a red-faced, indignant baby boy who was voicing his opinions about his arrival in the world at full volume. "He's loud," Nelson said. Susanna looked at the baby and then at Nelson, and her expression was something he had never seen from her before, not quite soft, because Susanna did not do soft, but something that had no armor in it at all, just the pure undefended feeling. "Of course he is," she said. "He's mine." Nelson sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son. "He needs a name," Susanna said. "He does." "I was thinking Daniel," she said, "if you agree." Nelson looked at her. The name sat between them with the weight of everything it carried: the cattle drive and the river and the watch and the 3 months of traveling to keep a promise, and then settled into something that felt not heavy but right. "Yes," he said. "Daniel." She handed him the baby, and Nelson held Daniel Winslow, who was very small and very loud and had his mother's intensity already visible in the way he occupied space. And the lamp burned, and outside the Wyoming winter moved against the windows, and inside the Waystation was warm. Young Daniel turned out to be exactly as advertised: loud, curious, opinionated, and possessed of a personality that the Waystation's main room could barely contain. By the time he was 18 months old, he had opinions about the horses, expressed in the fluent but not yet fully comprehensible language of toddlers, and he followed Petey around the yard like a satellite, which Petey, who was now 18 and had decided he was not leaving after all, accepted with the resigned affection of someone who has been drafted into a role he didn't ask for and turned out to be suited to. Susanna ran the Waystation, and Nelson worked it, and between them, they expanded it again in 1879. A second story with 3 more rooms, which made it the most substantial Waystation on the northern Wyoming route, and gave them a proper income that no longer required either of them to count months carefully. Susanna hired a woman named Agnes to help with the cooking, because she had made a practical assessment of what the expanded operation required, and reached the conclusion that she could not cook for 20 people and manage a business and raise a toddler simultaneously, and that attempting to do so would be a failure of the sensibleness she always claimed to have. Agnes was 52 and built like a woman who had spent decades accomplishing things, and she made biscuits that were, by universal consensus, the best biscuits in Wyoming Territory, which improved the reputation of the Waystation significantly. In 1880, Susanna told Nelson she was expecting again. This time she told him in the evening in the same kitchen at the same table, and his response was the same: stillness, then movement toward her, then the quiet certainty she had come to understand was the largest thing he knew how to offer. Their second child was a girl, born in October of 1880, and they named her Clara after Nelson's sister in Tennessee, who had by now been back in correspondence with Nelson for 2 years, and had sent a letter full of warmth and relief, and the particular emotion of a sibling who had assumed someone was gone and found out they were only quiet. Clara was, from her first weeks, entirely different from Daniel. She was attentive and still, and watched everything with large gray eyes that were exactly Nelson's eyes, and she slept with a thoroughness that impressed everyone who had experience with sleeping children. Susanna looked at this quiet, watchful baby and then at Nelson and said with great affection, "She's yours." "You say that like it's a warning," Nelson said. "It's a description," Susanna said. By 1882, Daniel was 4 and Clara was 2, and the Waystation had become a genuine institution. Travelers planned their routes to stop there. The dining room's reputation had spread through the territory in the way that good food and a remarkable host's reputation always spreads, carried by the mouths of everyone who has experienced it. Susanna had been written about in a Cheyenne newspaper, which she found embarrassing in the specific way that capable people who do not seek attention find being noticed embarrassing, and which Nelson cut out and kept in the account book where she would not throw it away. Petey, who was now 22, had taken over much of the yard management and was saving his wages toward a small spread of his own east of town. Susanna had negotiated a supply arrangement with a rancher named Delaney that gave them reliable grain and hay through the winters without the price uncertainty she had dealt with in her early years. Agnes's biscuits had become an attraction in their own right. In the evenings, after the guests had retired and the children were asleep, Nelson and Susanna sat at their table. It had become definitively their table in the way that things become when they have held enough important moments, and talked about everything. About Daniel and Clara and what kind of people they seemed to be becoming. About the news from the East, where the world was changing at a speed that sometimes felt vertiginous even from the measured distances of Wyoming. About the Waystation and its future, which Susanna had plans for that extended decades forward, which was how her mind worked, always toward the next thing, always building. "I want to put in a telegraph line," she said one evening, which was not as surprising as it sounds because the line was coming through the territory and several towns along the route had already applied. "You'd be the only Waystation with one," Nelson said. "That's the point," she said. "If travelers can send messages from here, they'll stop here specifically for that. And while they're here, they'll eat Agnes's biscuits and stay the night." "How much will it cost?" she told him. He thought about it. "What does the bank say?" "The bank says I'm a reliable customer with a solid record," she said, with the satisfaction of someone for whom this had not always been an easy thing to establish as a woman in this territory. "They'll extend the credit." "Then do it," he said. She looked at him. "You're not going to argue with me about it." "No," he said. "You've done the math. You know what this place can carry. If you say it's sound, it's sound." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with the frank gaze that he had learned to read across multiple layers, the surface gaze that was thinking, and the layer beneath it that was feeling. "I keep waiting," she said, "for you to have an opinion about something that contradicts mine." "I have opinions," he said with mild protest. "You agree with me a great deal." "You're usually right," he said. "Nelson," she said, "I'm not always right." "You're right more often than not," he said. "And when you're not, you figure it out faster than most people would. I see no reason to argue for the sake of it." She looked at him with something in her eyes that was not new but that never stopped landing exactly the same way every time she felt it. This full, clear, completely uncomplicated love for this quiet, steady, extraordinary man who had ridden 3 months to keep a promise and stayed for the rest of his life. "I love you," she said. She didn't say it often, not because she didn't feel it, but because she was Susanna and the things she felt most deeply she expressed in the practical language of action rather than declaration. But sometimes in the evenings at their table she said it. "I know," he said. "That is not the correct response," she said. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since approximately the second day you talked to me about the price of grain." "That is not romantic," she said. "It's true," he said, "which I think for us is better." She considered this for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I suppose it is." The telegraph line went in the following spring and was, as Susanna had predicted, immediately practical and immediately good for business. The first message she sent on it was to her lawyer in Cheyenne, confirming the terms of a land purchase, a small additional parcel east of the Waystation that she wanted for expansion of the corrals. The second message she sent was to Nelson's sister Clara in Tennessee, telling her that her namesake niece had spoken her first full sentence that morning, which was reportedly a demand for more of Agnes's biscuits, and therefore completely in keeping with the family character. Clara in Tennessee wrote back by letter, which was faster now that the mail was more reliable, and had by this point become a regular correspondent of Susanna's in a way that had developed gradually and organically, and which Nelson watched with quiet satisfaction, because his sister and his wife had significant personality similarities that he had noticed from the beginning and which made their correspondence, from the fragments Susanna shared at the table, frequently hilarious. In the summer of 1883, Harlan Cross came through the Waystation for the first time since the wedding, heading north to look at land in Montana, where he was thinking of retiring from trail driving and trying ranching. He sat at the dinner table with the family and ate Agnes's biscuits, and said they were the best he had had in any territory, and he talked with Nelson about the drives and the years, and the Haskell crossing in the way that men who have been through something together can talk about it once enough time has passed, not without weight, but without being destroyed by it. After dinner, Cross sat on the step with Nelson while Susanna put the children to bed, and the Wyoming summer evening stretched out around them, purple and wide. "Winslow," Cross said. "Cross." "Daniel Dugan would be pleased," the old trail boss said, simply, directly. Nelson looked out at the yard, where the horses were settling in the corrals and the evening star was coming up in the west. "Yes," he said, "I think he would." They sat in the comfortable silence of two men who had seen enough of the world to know that good things were not owed to anyone, and therefore worth the full weight of appreciation when they arrived. Inside the Waystation, Susanna was reading to Daniel and Clara, who were supposed to be going to sleep but who were, in Daniel's case, asking questions about every sentence and, in Clara's case, watching her mother with those observant gray eyes and absorbing everything. Susanna read the way she did everything with complete commitment, doing all the voices, never slowing down for the parts that seemed dull because she did not find them dull. Daniel contributed his opinions about the plot. Clara watched. The lamp cast its warm light over all of them. Later, after the children were finally and truly asleep and Cross had retired to his room, and the Waystation was as quiet as it ever got, Susanna came out to find Nelson still on the step, looking at the stars. She sat beside him. "Good evening," she said. "Good evening," he said. She leaned against him, something she had started doing somewhere in the past years without either of them marking the exact moment when it had begun, when she had decided that leaning was not weakness but choice, and he put his arm around her, and they looked at the Wyoming night together. Cross said Daniel would be pleased, Nelson said. She was quiet for a moment. "He'd be insufferable about it," she said. "He'd say I told you so about letting someone in." "He would have liked me," Nelson said with certainty. "Eventually," Susanna said, "he'd have tested you first. He'd have talked at you for weeks to see if you stayed sane." "That's what he did," Nelson pointed out. She laughed, and the sound of it went up into the clear Wyoming night like something that was meant to be there. "I know," she said. "He was testing you from the beginning. He just didn't know it would come to this." "Maybe he did," Nelson said. She thought about this. About Daniel, who had written letters about a man named Winslow who was the best listener he'd ever found. About Daniel, who had told her in his last letter to stop running the Waystation like a fortress. About Daniel, who had been 24 years old and was not supposed to die at a river crossing in Wyoming, and who had, in the improbable arithmetic of loss and grief and a kept promise, somehow managed to give her everything good that had happened since. "Maybe he did," she said. She took the watch out of her pocket. She still kept it, every day in her apron pocket, the way she had since the night Nelson had put it on the table between them and held it in her hand. The night was warm for Wyoming, warm and still, and the stars were the particular density that you only get in high country away from towns. "I want to give this to Daniel," she said, "when he's old enough. I want him to know where it came from." "He'll want to know the whole story," Nelson said. "Then we'll tell him the whole story." She turned the watch in her fingers, the familiar weight of it, all of it, the drive and the crossing and his uncle and the quiet man who rode 3 months to keep a promise. Nelson looked at her sideways. "The quiet man. The quietest man," she said, with the specific warmth she reserved for things she loved completely. "At a very loud Waystation." "The loudest Waystation," he agreed. She leaned up and kissed him, brief and certain, in the manner of people who have kissed many times and no longer need to make a ceremony of it, and then leaned back against his shoulder. "Agnes says she's going to teach Clara to make biscuits," Susanna said. "I told her Clara is 2 years old." "Agnes will find a way," Nelson said. "She will. She's formidable." Susanna was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking about the east parcel. If we clear the scrub on the north edge, we could put in a kitchen garden. Real vegetables, not just what I can get from the supply wagon. It would cut costs and improve the meals." "The soil in that section might be thin," Nelson said. "We'd want to amend it." "I know. There's a man near town who keeps cattle, Delaney's neighbor. He's got more manure than he knows what to do with. I was thinking of making him an arrangement." Nelson was quiet for a moment. "What?" she said. "I love you," he said. "And the fact that you are discussing manure arrangements under a field of stars at 9 in the evening is one of my favorite things about you." She considered this. "That is a very specific thing to love about someone." "Yes," he agreed. She laughed again, and it was that laugh, the one with no ceiling on it. The one that filled whatever room it was in and then kept going. The one that had been the second thing he'd noticed about her, and was still, after all the years, the best sound he knew. Inside the Waystation, the lamp burned low in the children's room, and Daniel slept sprawled with the total physical commitment of a 4-year-old. And Clara slept quietly with her eyes moving slightly under her lids, as if she was watching something in her sleep and taking notes. The dining room with its 12 seats and its afternoon windows sat ready for the morning traffic. Agnes's kitchen was clean and ordered, prepared for the next day's biscuits. The telegraph equipment sat silent in its corner, waiting for tomorrow's messages. Outside, the corrals were quiet and the horses were settled, and the road ran north and south through the territory under a sky so full of stars it almost groaned with them. And on the step of the Waystation, in the warm Wyoming night, the loudest woman and the quietest man sat together in the specific, earned, wholly unremarkable and wholly extraordinary happiness of two people who had found their way to the same place by accident and had made it permanent by choice. The watch ticked in Susanna's hand, keeping steady time. Nelson said nothing, because he didn't need to. Susanna said nothing, which was perhaps the rarest and most definitive measure of how complete she felt, because Susanna Dugan had never in her life run out of things to say, but here now, with his arm around her and the night spread out above them, and the Waystation warm at their backs, and everything they had built surrounding them in all directions, she found that she had arrived at the perfect, sufficient, exactly enough place where words were simply not required. She put her head on his shoulder. He pulled her slightly closer. The stars did what stars do over Wyoming on a clear summer night, burned fierce and constant and indifferent and beautiful. And the Waystation held its warmth against the dark, and everything was, as far as either of them could measure it, exactly as it was supposed to be.